Tank Commander Alexander Kruger felt the weight of his responsibilities heavily as he surveyed the desolate battlefield. Smoke billowed from burning wreckage and the acrid stench of scorched metal filled the air. His tank, ironclad, a Lehman Russ battle tank, was the last of his platoon still operational. The others had fallen one by one to enemy fire until only he remained. Kruger's eyes darted across the battlefield, scanning for any sign of the enemy. His fingers tightened around his binocs as he prepared for what he knew would be the fight of his life. His Lehman Russ was a formidable vehicle and had seen its fair share of the fighting, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He knew he had to rely on his own intuition and the skill of his crew to survive. "Status report," he barked into the comm system. "Main cannon operational, sir," replied Gunner Corporal Jontius Bales. "Turret rotation at 80%. Running low on bolter rounds, though." "Hull integrity at 75%, reported Driver Private First Class Sarah Kimber. "Engine functioning at 90%. "Communication systems are still functioning," added Communications Specialist Private Marcus Pers. "But I'm not picking up any Imperial transmissions." Kruger grimaced. They were truly alone. "Keep your eyes open, everyone," he said. "We're in enemy territory now." The tank rumbled forward, its tired treads crushing the debris and bone beneath them. The crunching sound of metal on metal amplified inside the small crew compartment. Kruger scanned the horizon, trying to get a sense of the enemy's position. He didn't have to wait long. Kruger peered through the binocs, head peering out the top of the tank, scanning the barren wasteland for any signs of movement. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye, and he quickly adjusted the lenses to get a better view. A group of enemy tanks emerged from behind a hill, their weapons trained on his vehicle, putrid smoke billowing from their exhausts. The tanks resembled Imperial Guard tanks. The Lehman Russ pattern was unmistakable even from a distance. But the exception was that the outsides were adorned with flayed bodies and heads atop spikes. Kruger's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared for the inevitable battle. "There, on the ridge," he said, pointing towards a group of enemy tanks in the distance. "Sarah, bring us around." Sarah deftly maneuvered the tank towards the ridge, the treads kicking up clouds of dust and debris as they advanced. The ancient engine growled, spitting black smoke behind them. The enemy tanks came into view, their gun turrets already swiveling in their direction. "Bales, target the lead tank, 119 degrees, he ordered. "Target acquired, sir." "Fire." Bales, without hesitation, focused on the enemy armor. He carefully aimed the tank's main gun, adjusting for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The tank shuddered as the shell hurtled towards its target, followed by the unmistakable sound of the shell-piercing armor as it made contact. "Again!" Kruger yelled. As soon as the autoloader fed the next round, the Lehman Russ roared again as the main cannon fired. The shell struck the enemy tank again, this time bouncing off the front plate and struck a nearby building, exploding in a shower of sparks and flame. "Kimby!" Kruger started, but Sarah was already in motion, plunging the tank into reverse to maneuver behind a broken plascrete wall. But there were more of them. The other tanks opened fire, their shells slamming into the ironclad. Sarah's hands flew across the controls as she tried to evade the incoming fire. She pushed the tank to the left, narrowly avoiding a direct hit. She could feel the tank shudder with the force of the impact close by, the sound of debris showering the outside of their cramped quarters. The enemy tank was quick to react, though, firing off another shot. This time the ironclad rocked from the impact, the crew thrown off balance as the tank's internal systems protested the hit. "Get us out of here, Sarah," he shouted. The tank lurched forward, but it was too late. Another enemy shell hit them, causing the ironclad to shake uncontrollably. Smoke filled the crew compartment. Kruger coughed and struggled to regain his bearings as the tank came to a stop. It was the loudest thing he had ever heard. He looked around, taking in the damage. He noticed blood running down his right arm. "Damage report," Kruger barked, his eyes scanning the control panel for any signs of malfunction. The main cannon was still operational, but the right sponson weapon was completely destroyed, the hole where it once was on fire and smouldering. The turret groaned wearily when attempting to move but was completely jammed. The hull was bent inwards, making the already small compartment even more so, and the engine was smoking a thick purple smoke, indicating to Kruger it was burning something other than promethium. He gritted his teeth and cursed under his breath. his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. They were in trouble, and the enemy tanks were closing in fast. "Sarah, can we move?" asked Kruger. "I think so, sir," she replied, moving her jet-black hair now in her face away so she could wipe the blood and sweat from her forehead. The tank throttled backwards, main gun facing forward. Kruger, with binocs pressed firmly against his face, scanning the horizon for enemy movement. Slowly but surely they managed to get inside a mostly enclosed building, smashing through walls of an abandoned HAB unit as they traversed. What was left of the daylight was peeking through the rafters of their temporary hiding position, yellow clouds of acid in the upper atmosphere visible through the broken roof. "We need to get out and make repairs," he ordered. "We're not done yet. Emperor, help us." Kruger watched as his crew scrambled out of the tank, each of them carrying a toolkit. He was proud of his team. They were young, but they were some of the best soldiers he'd ever had the privilege of working with. Bales was a muscular man, with broad shoulders and a rugged, weathered face. He had a bald head and a thick beard, which normally neatly trimmed was long and ragged. His eyes, a piercing blue, reflected what Kruger always saw in him: intensity and focus. He was always calm and collected, even in the midst of battle, and he had a reputation for being unflappable under pressure. Driver Private First Class Sarah Kimber was a natural behind the controls of the tank. She was a petite woman, with short black hair and bright, expressive eyes. Despite her small size, she is a skilled driver, and she was able to maneuver the ironclad with great precision and control. She was also a bit of a chatterbox, but sometimes it helped to lighten the mood during tense situations. Communications specialist Private Marcus Pertz was the newest member of the crew, but he had proven himself to be a valuable asset. Pertz was a young man, with short curly brown hair and built like a twig. Eager to learn and always seeking new knowledge, it made him excellent at his job. Kruger himself was on Kaidia when Abaddon came with his black ships, and before that, so many battles, more than he could count. He was over 100 standard years old, and had risen through the ranks to become an armoured commander of the Cadian 926th. By this time in his career, he knew the value of a good crew. "Let's get to work," he said, and they set about repairing the ancient machine. Bales climbed up onto the turret, large wrench in hand. He worked quickly, jamming the wrench into the top of the turret mechanism to try and unjam it. Kimber and Pers worked on the engine, prying off the panels to expose the engine compartment, desperate to find the source of the thick purple exhaust. Kruger himself was underneath the tank, inspecting the hull. He winced as he saw the damage. It was going to take more than belief in the Emperor to get the tank back into fighting shape. The bolter that once was attached to the right sponson was only a smouldering mess of cables. The bolter itself was still attached by its ammo belt, but they had been dragging it for quite some time. Sparks from their welding lit the dim building. As they worked, the sound of enemy tanks grew closer, the ground shaking in an all-too-familiar way. Kruger looked up at his crew, the adrenaline in his blood beginning to course through his veins. "Damn heretics," he grumbled. "We've got incoming." The crew scrambled to finish their repairs, working as fast as they could. Kruger climbed back into the tank, taking his position on top, binocs ready. "Bales, get ready," he said. "We're going to take them head-on." The ironclad roared back to life, its engines revving, the machine spirit clearly appeased. Sarah steered it towards the oncoming enemy tanks, her fingers tight on the controls. "Contact, 140 degrees. Load armor penetrating round, slow to quarter. Make it count, Bales," Kruger said, speaking calmly now, years of experience kicking in. Bales fired the main cannon, striking one of the enemy tanks. This time the round made it downstream and hit the enemy turret almost dead center, its turret splaying out and causing fire to shoot from the top hatch. "Good hit, Bales," yelled Kruger. The other tank swerved to avoid the wreckage, giving Kruger an opening. She jammed the Lehman Russ to the left, avoiding enemy fire. 192 this time, it's mid-turn. Hit it now, barked Kruger. Bales was already on it. The machine spirit fed the next round, and with a bang it ejected towards its target, striking the enemy tank in its side. This time bodies flew out in every direction. Kruger couldn't tell if they were members of the crew, or if they were the decorative bodies that littered the front. "Sarah, hit it," he shouted. "Let's get out of here." "Sarah, hit it," Kruger shouted. "Let's get out of here." The tank lurched forward, speeding away from the enemy, exhaust sputtering. They could hear the sound of enemy fire behind them, but most of its small arms, plinking against what was left of their reinforced armor. Kruger was determined to get his crew to safety. "Perce, see if you can patch us through to the rest of the platoon," he said. Perce worked quickly, his fingers flying across the communications console. Kruger could hear the sound of static as he tried to connect to the other tanks. "Got it," Perce said finally. "I've got Sergeant Raymer on the line." Kruger breathed a sigh of relief. They weren't alone anymore. "Sergeant, this is Kruger," he said. "We're the last tank of the 378th platoon. We've taken heavy fire and our tank is damaged. We need backup." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Kruger held his breath, waiting for a response. "Hang tight, Kruger. The Emperor is with you this day," Raymer finally said. "We're on our way." Kruger and his crew waited anxiously, scanning the horizon. Finally a glimmer of movement. Then he heard the sound of the rest of the platoon approaching. He spun around in the cupola of the tank, and he could see the enemy tanks in the distance, lining up for another attack immediately behind them, with him and his crew right in the middle. "Everyone, this is it," he said. "Sarah, turn us around." Sarah pushed both throttles in opposite directions, causing the tank to make a 180-degree spin in place, but then rumbled forward, heading straight towards the enemy. The other tanks of the platoon flanked them, firing their weapons in a coordinated attack. Sarah pushed the tank to the left, narrowly avoiding an enemy shell, dirt exploding to the right of Kruger. Bales fired the main cannon, striking an enemy tank in the engine and causing it to explode. Kruger was firing the top-mounted storm bolter, taking out enemy infantry that were trying to flank them. He'd seen enemies like this before, but never this close. Thankfully, they're just humans, I think, he thought. Kimber was making the 70-ton tank dance and weave, making it an elusive target for enemy fire. Perce still on comms, relaying firing positions and yelling constantly, keeping them connected to the rest of the platoon. He shouted out orders as they came in, coordinating their attacks and movements. Kruger felt a surge of pride as he watched his crew in action. They were a well-oiled machine, each member playing their part to perfection. He knew they had a good chance of coming out of this alive, but the enemy wasn't going down without a fight. They had brought out their heavy artillery, and Kruger knew they were in for a rough ride. "Brace yourselves," he shouted to his crew. The enemy tanks fired their shells, hitting the ground around them and sending up plumes of dirt and debris. The Lehman Russ shuddered under the impact, but Sarah kept it moving. Bales fired the main cannon, striking another enemy tank and causing its treads to fly off in the opposite direction and grinding it to a halt. The other tanks of the platoon continued to flank them, firing their weapons in a coordinated attack. Kruger could feel the sweat dripping down his face as he concentrated on commanding his crew. His focus unwavering, he only slightly noticed that he couldn't feel most of his right arm now. "Keep moving," he shouted to his crew. "We can duck." It was then another shell struck them with the same intensity as the one from earlier. A direct hit to their engine caused it to stall. Thankfully, they were relatively unharmed this time, aside from the ringing in their ears. "Damn it!" Kruger cursed. Kimber tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't budge. The other tanks of the platoon had moved ahead, leaving them exposed to enemy fire. Kruger could hear the sound of enemy tanks approaching. They were surrounded with nowhere to run. Kruger sat in the commander's seat of his faithful tank, staring out at the approaching enemy horde. He knew that with the ironclad disabled, that his crew's chances of survival were slim, but he would not let them take their lives so easily. He would kill the enemy until he could no longer, as he'd done his entire life. Bales scanned the battlefield with his sights, targeting enemy infantry with the hull-mounted heavy bolter that were closing in on them. The bolter made quick work of the red and black armored men encroaching on their position. Kruger watched as one enemy who got particularly close exploded, chest first, as the bolter round made contact. Kimber worked frantically to get the engine running again, but it was no use. The tank was dead in the water. "We're out of bolter ammo, Commander," said Bales. Kruger nodded. He knew that the odds were against them, but he refused to let his crew give up hope. Kruger sat in the commander's seat of his faithful tank, staring out at the approaching enemy horde. He knew that with the ironclad disabled, that his crew's chances of survival were slim, but he would not let them take their lives so easily. He would kill the enemy until he could no longer, as he'd done his entire life. Bales scanned the battlefield with his sights, targeting enemy infantry with the hull-mounted heavy bolter that were closing in on them. The bolter made quick work of the red and black armoured men encroaching on their position. Kruger watched as one enemy who got particularly close exploded, chest first, as the bolter round made contact. Kimber worked frantically to get the engine running again, but it was no use. The tank was dead in the water. "We're out of bolter ammo, Commander," said Bales. Kruger nodded. He knew that the odds were against them, but he refused to let his crew give up hope. "Remember your training," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "We are the Emperor's chosen, and we will not fall today. We fight until our dying breaths." He gripped his chainsword that was stashed behind his commander's chair. The enemy began to swarm around the tank, gunfire raining down on them from all sides. Kruger barked orders to his crew, directing their fire towards the enemy's weakest points. The tank's main cannon fired relentlessly, blasting apart enemy vehicles and shredding infantry, the autoloader feeding the few remaining shells they had left. But the enemy kept coming, and Kruger knew that it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. He gripped his chainsword and began to twist the bar to open the top hatch, his crew too focused on each of their duties to notice. "Sir!" Bales started. "They're all around." Just then another explosion. A burst of blood shot through the interior of the cabin. It was unclear who it belonged to at first. The right side of the tank was open now. Kruger was disoriented, but felt around for his las pistol. His fingers closed around the grip of his las pistol, and he turned to face the opening in the tank's side. Through the smoke and debris, he could make out the silhouettes of the enemy soldiers swarming towards him. He took a deep breath and steadied his aim, knowing that he had only one chance to make it count. He squeezed the trigger, and a bolt of energy shot out from the las pistol, striking one of the enemy soldiers in the chest and sending him flying backwards. As quickly as he fell, another shadow appeared. This one grabbed Sarah and pulled her out by her face. She was unconscious and didn't move as she was pulled outside. Kruger thought that was probably for the best. He could tell now that it was Pers whose blood had covered the interior of the cabin. What remained of his body was slumped over the controls, static hissing from his headset. Bales was conscious, but his legs were broken. He was slumped over, rummaging through a rucksack close to him. "Melter mines, Commander." "For the Emperor." Kruger nodded. "For the Emperor." Bales pulled out the mine and twisted the timer. A man in spiked armor pushed himself into the compartment, close enough now for Kruger to get a good look at him. His face was stretched back, revealing black teeth and a permanent grin. His armor was Imperial Guard standard issue, but adorned with the Star of Chaos written in dried blood. The enemy grabbed Kruger by his coat and pulled him towards his disgusting scar-ridden leather face, simultaneously pulling a rusty knife from behind him. Kruger felt the hilt of his chainsword, finger on the trigger. In the cramped quarters he couldn't spin it around, but was able to pull it up in front of his chest upside down, business end facing out. As the rusty knife came down on him, Kruger engaged the chainsword. With a roar it spun to life, ripping into the enemy soldier, blood spraying into Kruger's face, flesh, sinew and armor scraps covering the interior of the tank. 10 seconds, Commander. It's been an honor, sir," Bales shouted. Kruger nodded, the enemy now slumped over on top of him as he sat in his chair, covered in bits of bone, blood and hair. Kruger thought to himself that he knew on some level it would always end like this. He was glad it was on his terms, and that he'd be taking heretics with him. The last thing they felt was the warmth and glow of the melter mines from Bales's pack as they reached their zenith. Like the sunrise on Cadia, how nice, Kruger thought. Like the sunrise on Cadia. How nice, Kruger thought.